Hello. It's time to begin. Did I drop the controller there? Okay. So we're going to be starting in our Moses and Exodus class, number 15. And we're going to start off with Moses, which means we are almost out of Genesis. Just took me a few months. So the last thing of note about Genesis is about Moses as the author in general. And so there is something called the documentary hypothesis. This is from the late 1800s that try to say that the whole Torah has four different authors. We have the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly material author. This is basically upon what name of God is used and some information. And this is not really divvied out in any logical sense. It's this passage here, this verse here, this chapter here, all willy-nilly randomly, basically. And some of the evidence they use to support this is that in the writings themselves, there's no clear statement that Moses is the author of Genesis and the Torah in general. We have him writing down certain things. We say here that Moses wrote this down, or Moses wrote that down. But it doesn't say that I am Moses and I wrote all this. But we do have a number of other biblical authors, mainly Jesus himself, that do hold to Moses writing the whole of Torah. This is basically agreed upon. So overall, I wish I could go through and point out each individual thing and say how that's wrong, but really there's not that much information to support this. I just want to mention this in case you guys come across this, but overall, there's nothing really to support. So I can't really go more in detail than that. But if you have any questions about that, if you come across something different, let me know. Another reason why I mention this is because a lot of people say that Moses couldn't have written it as there was no writing in use back then. That is not the case. In fact, the first alphabet in record was found to be about the time just before Moses, and by that I mean a few centuries as it was developing. Now, I mean alphabet, not writing. Writing and alphabet are two different things. Alphabet is a form of writing. The alphabet comes from either alpha, beta, or aleph, bet, depending on Greek versus Hebrew. And this was formed in the area of Egypt from either the 1800s down to the 1400s BC. There is some discussion on those exact dates, but sometime in this area. There are some people that try to link this to Israel, but since we have the Hyksos there as well in this period, or even other Semitic slaves, it's hard to say who actually formed this. Now, Sinai 361 is one of these tablets that have Proto-Hebrew writing on it. Now, this is one of the later forms that are nearly fully developed into Proto-Hebrew. You can see a picture of it in the top left with a drawing of it in the bottom or in the center left. The bottom left are Egyptian hieroglyphics. We'll get a bit more into this later on as far as how they developed this, but just remember that there is writing at the time of Moses. We also have a number of Egyptian loanwords in the Pentateuch. These are words that are transliteration to known Egyptian words, meaning that some of the words that they were using, some of the words that Moses used, came from Egyptian words, which makes sense if they came out of an Egyptian culture. They would have had some words, such as the word for Nile in Exodus 2:3, that is a transliteration of the ITRW Egyptian word. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. But the normal Hebrew word is Nahar. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't know for sure. Again, I'm not Hebrew or an Egyptianologist. Anyway, the point is that the language itself both fits the time as well as the words used fit the time for Moses to have written this when the Bible says he did. I also want to make a note, I did mention this briefly last time, but there is an idea that is dying out, it's not as common anymore, that the Exodus occurred in the 1300s. This puts it far further into the future than the past. Now, the Bible, based upon what we know, the Exodus occurred about 1446, 1447, so considerable time after that. The main reason for this date was because of the city Ramses mentioned in Genesis 47:11. This is the city of Ramses that was built by the Pharaoh Ramses of the 19th dynasty. A few problems with this, though, is because it doesn't really fit well the Egyptian chronology or the Bible chronology. As far as the Egyptian chronology, Ramses reigned 1290 to 1223 BC, after the supposed date. So they have to change the Egyptian history a bit. but they can't move it too far forward, too far into the future, because basically there's all kinds of events that happened in Canaan that we can connect with the Israelite people. And so it doesn't really fit either way. Now, the reason why the city is named Ramses in Genesis 47:11, not the name of Moses' time, is because there have been textual updates. We frequently find these. I did mention them last time, but Ur of the Chaldeans is to signify which Ur that was. Unfortunately, since that has changed, we don't know which Ur of the Chaldeans it is. There also is the city of Dan. This was located in the Levant in Canaan, named after the tribe of Dan. But in Genesis, the tribe of Dan was not a thing yet the city was still called Dan. This is done to help people's understanding of these sites and words, because places change their names very frequently. I'm sure you can think of a number of places that you've been that have different names. Think of Istanbul and Constantinople, that fun song. But all these things do change, and so they're trying to make sure that the scripture was still understandable by the people of the day. Now, for the timeline of Moses, it's going to fit something like this. He was born about 1527 BC. We know that when he was about 40 years old, thanks to Acts 7, that he murdered an Egyptian and fled to Midian. And when he was 80, in 1447, we know that the king of Egypt died. Yahweh then appears to Moses in the burning bush, and then Moses and Aaron then confront the new Pharaoh. In 1407 BC, Moses dies at the age of 120. We can then connect these dates to the reign of Solomon from 1 Kings 6:1. This is consistent with some times in the Chronicles and Judges. In Judges, we have a statement by Jephthah about there being 300 some years since they came into Canaan. And then in 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37, we see that there's 19 generations from the Exodus to Solomon. If you assume the average number of years in a generation, you're going to get 25 years per generation, meaning about 475 years compared to the 480 years given in the First Kings. So all fits very well. Now there are some questions about the Exodus and matching it with Egyptian chronology. To do this, though, we have to figure out who were the pharaohs. Now, in Genesis, the names of the pharaohs are not mentioned. While this is somewhat inconvenient, it is strong support that the historical writer of the Torah was alive at this time. So, at this time, we do not have kings, rulers, mentioning foreign rulers or foreign lands other than by their people. You don't want to give your enemy any notoriety, any publicity. It was considered just bad, not good. But later on, centuries later, we can see even in Kings and Chronicles, let alone other extra-biblical histories, that the names are started to be mentioned. And so, the same thing would have occurred in Egypt. We're not likely to find any reference to Israel doing this to Egypt, or Moses for that matter, or any of these events. Remember, Egyptians were master propagandists. You don't give yourself bad, publicity. You just don't. You erase that. You write something else down. And so it's going to be somewhat hard to fit this in with the Egyptian chronology, because they're not going to want to put this down there because it's very bad looking for them. They got completely wiped out from this. Now, we're going to try to identify the enslavement pharaoh. So we know from Exodus 1, 8 through 10, that a new king arose over Egypt. He's not mentioned by name. And we know that the persecution and the Pharaoh did not know Joseph. So it had to occur after Joseph and his brother's death. Now, did some math here. It wasn't fun math, but it was math. Now, Joseph, we know, died at 110. Levi, we know, died at 137. So Joseph died before Levi. Based upon some math, Levi can be between 4.5 and 16.5 years older than Joseph. And Joseph was 30 when he entered Pharaoh's service. So that means Levi was between 34 and 47 years old when he came to Canaan. So that gives us a minimum of 81 to 94 years prior to the persecution. So this is how much time has to expire before the persecution can arise. So if you have a time for Joseph being in there, We have to have this time period before this new enslavement pharaoh can appear. We also have the pharaoh that sought Moses. Again, he's not mentioned by name. And while he could be the same as the enslavement pharaoh, we have a maximum of 134 to 121 years from the enslavement pharaoh to the Exodus. So it's not likely. We also have a requirement of over 40 years of reign, because he sought to kill Moses for Moses' premeditated murder of an Egyptian, and he did look around to make sure he wouldn't get caught, and he still got caught. So it was somewhat premeditated. And we know that he died from Exodus 2:23 and Exodus 4:19. And we know that Moses was 40 when he left and 80 when he came back. So about 40 years reign. Has to be over that, in fact. We also have a third pharaoh, the pharaoh of the plagues. Again, not mentioned by name. He is going to be the successor of the previous pharaoh. And he's also not the firstborn of the previous pharaoh, nor was followed by a firstborn son. This is because of the 10th plague that killed the firstborn. It didn't kill him, and it would have killed him if he was a firstborn. And he may or may not have died in the Red Sea. We know his men did. In Psalms 136:15, it says that, "But overthrew, shook off Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever." This, to shirk off or flick off, is like a locust. David uses this also. So it could just mean that he was defeated. He was pushed away from from Israel. Israel was no longer underneath this Pharaoh. So he may have died, he may not have. But if he didn't die, this would have likely affected the rest of his reign. We should see some signs in the rest of his reign of the Exodus. So let's look at Egyptian history now. If you remember from last time, Egyptian history fits something like this. You have the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. Remember, not a lot of evidence. The Old Kingdom, where Egypt tends to be united. The First Intermediate. The Middle Kingdom. This is where the 12th dynasty is at, that we talked about last time. The Second Intermediate, this is where the Hyksos come in, where Joseph likely comes in. And then the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is the height of Egyptian authority and power. After the New Kingdom, you have the Third Intermediate, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. So the Egyptians really never gained power after this. Egypt as a whole was strong and used by these nations, but it was never a nation unto itself again. In the New Kingdom, we have two major dynasties, the 18th and the 19th. And if you know any name of a pharaoh, it is likely in one of these two lists. The 18th dynasty was the first, of course, followed by the 19th. So, who is the enslavement pharaoh? These are the requirements we have to get for the enslavement pharaoh, just a reminder. Well, Ahmose I is the best candidate for this. He reigned from 1560 to 1550 BC. He's the pharaoh that chased out the Hyksos. So those foreign rulers that likely raised Joseph to power were chased out by this man, as well as his brother and his father. This makes sense with what Exodus 1:8-10 says, where this pharaoh says, "In the event of war, they even will join themselves to the ones hating us and fight against us and depart from the land." So we have these people living in Egypt that Pharaoh here in the Bible does not want to join their enemies, the ones that hate us, that hate Egypt, and would depart. This makes sense if he just chased out the Hyksos, who were very close, at least culturally, with the Israelites. And also fits the timeline that we're trying to get in here. So from where Joseph entered Egypt in Israel, 1661 BC, to 1560 BC, where Ahmose begins his rule, is about 101 years. So we're over the minimum. We're right where we need to be. Meaning that Levi has been dead for just under a decade when Ahmose gains power, give or take. So Ahmose I is likely the enslavement pharaoh, the pharaoh who did not know Joseph. But he is by far the easiest to fit because he has the least requirements. Let's see if we can fit any of the others. So here is the pharaoh that sought Moses. Again, 40-year reign, over a 40-year reign. This is very rare, and we have some good data to understand the reigns of these Egyptian pharaohs. The best one, in fact the only one that really fits this, is Tutmosis III. He reigned from 15004 BC to 1450 BC, so about 54 years. No other pharaoh of the 18th dynasty matches this. The only other pharaoh of the New Kingdom period was Ramses II, which no one holds him being the pharaoh that sought Moses. Now, we have to have a maximum of 134 to 121 years of persecution between the pharaoh of the Exodus and Ahmose I. So we have, at the end of Tutmos, 110 years between the end of his reign and Ahmose I reign. So we're still within this period. Now, Tutmosis III was called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Not at that time. We call him that today, of course, because Napoleon wasn't there then. But he was like Napoleon. He was the one at the Battle of Megiddo. This is the oldest recorded battle in secular history, 1480 BC. One of many campaigns in the Canaan and Levant region, defeated the arch rivals of Egypt, the Mitanni kingdom. You can see a map where they were, right next to the Hittites, and made Canaan a vassal kingdom of Egypt. So all the states in Canaan were vassals to Egypt at this time. He was a great leader, according to Egypt, and beloved by the military. Now the last pharaoh, the pharaoh of the plagues, has the most requirements. He's going to be the hardest to match, and he has to be the one that comes right after Tutmosis III. And the one that comes after him is Amenhotep II. He reigns from 1453 to 1416 BC. Now there is some uncertainty about the end of his reign, because based upon his mummy, he doesn't appear this old. But that's just some uncertainty. We're not really concerned about the last decade or so of his reign. We're more concerned about the beginning, the first decade of his reign. He was the successor of Tutmosis III, and he had a bit of a Napoleon complex. His father was the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. He had the Napoleon complex of ancient Egypt. He had to be as athletic as his father was. So he exaggerated everything, even by Egyptian standards. He could row faster than 200 men. I misspoke. He could shoot a bow through a palm-thick piece of copper. That's not really doable, but okay. So he had to really talk himself up. He was not the firstborn, nor followed by a firstborn son. And we're right in the middle of the maximum potential years. So we're right there. It fits very well with the biblical timeline. Furthermore, he even lived in Avaris. This is the city, that Israel is connected with most in Egypt. And he did not die in the Red Sea. So we know he lived past the Exodus. Now, this isn't a requirement, but it does fit with the biblical narrative. But since he lived, it would have affected the rest of his reign. In the 9th year of his reign, this would have been about a few months after the Exodus, he went out in November. That's not usually when kings would go out to have campaign. It's not the right time of year for that. And he brought back over 100,000 slaves. His father, Tutmosis III, throughout all his campaigns in a 54-year rule, only brought about 6,000 slaves back. Now, while he could have been exaggerating, in one campaign, that is an extreme exaggeration. So he likely brought back quite a number of slaves. And that makes sense with exactly what we see occurring in the biblical narrative. He also doesn't really have any other major campaigns. He didn't do much of note after this. And what I think is most interesting is he actually warned his viceroy to be wary of foreign peoples and their witchcraft. Do not listen to their words and do not heed their messages. It sounds like he had a previous bad experience. Mm-hmm. And so it fits very, very well. He is also the one that began the destruction of Hatshepsut's images. You may be wondering, who is this? Well, she was a woman of some note that lived before him. And she actually fits very well with the person of Pharaoh's daughter in the Exodus narrative. She not only was Pharaoh's daughter, but she reigned as Pharaoh from 1504 to 1483 BC. She was the daughter of Tutmosis I. and is likely the princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, who took Moses out of the Nile. So when she was born 1532 BC. She was likely a young girl / early teens when she pulled out Moses out of the Nile. There is some uncertainty with any chronology as far as the exact age. We can't be sure, but we can be pretty close to this. She was also married to her half-brother, Tutmosis II. This is because Tutmosis II was Tutmosis the first son, but through a concubine, basically. So he had no right to the throne. So to give him that right, he married Hatshepsut because she was the daughter of Pharaoh and his queen. Well, he subsequently died without giving her an heir. So she reigned as regent to her stepson, Tutmosis III, who basically was the same situation, a child from a concubine. And so several years pass as her being pharaoh, 10 to 20 years, give or take. And then she would have died about the same time as Moses fleeing to Midian. Now, she was, as far as Egyptians were concerned, a decent pharaoh. She had a lot of building projects. She didn't really have many campaigns. Tutmosis III would have been involved in a lot of the military campaigns, and the army loved him, as I said before. But later, after she died, she had a national desecration campaign done against her, meaning that throughout the land of Egypt, all of her images and names were destroyed. We have just a little bit remaining of her. And remember, according to Egyptian mythology, erasing a person's name was erasing them from the afterlife. This is a very bad thing you could do to somebody that you really hated. Now, originally, it was thought to be her successor, Tutmosis III, that did this. But this doesn't seem to have occurred right after her death. In fact, Tutmosis III continued to build some of her projects. You can actually go to Egypt today and see some of the things that she built. So perhaps Amenhotep II, after Moses, the child that she drew from the Nile, left Exodus, he was very upset about this and blamed her. That is the best understanding for her national desecration campaign. And if, with all this fitting, we can actually fit a few others. Based upon the timeline, Tutmosis I would have been the one that would have started killing the Hebrew boys. And if you look at his reign, 1529 to 1516 BC, it would explain why Aaron was not killed, but Moses was tried to have been killed, because Aaron was 3 years older than Moses. And if you look, he would have been born the year before Tutmosis I came to the throne. Moses 2 years after. So as soon as he came to the throne, it seems that he had something against the Hebrew people. We also have the city of Aris. Remember, Amenhotep II lived at Avaris. Now, in Exodus 7:14 through 15, we have the Pharaoh of the Exodus narrative going to the Nile. So this requires there be a palace suitable for Pharaoh, since he's not going to stay at a 2-star hotel. And it needs to be near the Nile. Avaris has such a palace. Now, it had a 10-foot wide interior foundation wall to support a massive superstructure, a royal citadel, and it had 3 palaces, the largest being 525 by 255 feet. It even had an artificial lake 525 by 190 feet, and many other buildings. So this was a large royal complex. And this city was used as a jumping off point for campaigns east. So it was the place where Pharaoh would gather his army and go east. And this city was abandoned during the reign of Amenhotep II. This major city, utilized by Pharaoh, suddenly gone. Just abandoned. So now we're going to talk about the plagues and the crossing of the sea. So the stage is set for Exodus. We have a time for the Exodus to occur. All the main Egyptian peoples fit with known historical figures. It fits the events, the motives, the location, and the timeline that we get in the biblical narrative. Now, the Exodus was a specific and controlled destruction of Egypt and the deities reigning over them, and would have occurred starting in 1447 BC. And this seems to have taken about a year. This is based upon the straw collecting in the month of Iyar, and they left in Nisan, so 10 plagues in about 12 months. And this also fits with the rabbi traditions, the Jewish traditions. And just like any family trying to leave for a major trip, it took a little bit longer to get started than expected. Sorry. So in Egypt, there were no weekends. I know it's shocking, but there weren't. They also had a 10-day work week. So in Egypt at this time, even the slaves had religious holidays off. Israel didn't, because the God of Israel was not accepted in Egypt. Who is God that I should listen to him? So Moses is basically initially requesting just to have a few days off work. That's all he's asking. Well, like many bosses, Pharaoh didn't like that. So the first 3 plagues, we have the serpent staff, the Nile to blood, frogs, and lice. Aaron is the one that seems to announce these plagues, but the magicians can keep up. They can do something of this until the 3rd plague. So the first plague, the Nile to blood, is going against Hapi and Osiris. Frogs would be Hecate, the goddess of fertility. She had the head of a frog. And Geb, the god of the earth. Remember, the lice were formed from the earth, so this was something against him. These were either destroying or using these things to hurt Egypt, showing that the gods were not in control. We have plagues 4 and 5. Moses is beginning to announce these plagues, so he's seeming to be coming into his own. Some time has passed. Remember, likely a year. So we're getting through those few months. Now this is when we start to see an exception occur because of Israel and Goshen. So a clear people being punished and people not being punished. We have the flies, Khepri, I'm assuming, the god of creation, head of a fly. And then we have the death of the livestock, Hathor and Apis, head of a cow and the god of livestock. Plague 6 and 7, again Moses declaring the plagues. We have an exemption here that seems to be just for those being inside, so even those not of Israel may have been able to avoid this plague to some extent. But boils and sores, Isis, the goddess of medicine, and the hail and fire, Nut, the goddess of sky. We then have plagues 8, 9, and 10. This is when we start to see Pharaoh bargaining with Moses. Now, Moses, again, is announcing the plagues, but there doesn't seem to be any exception for these, at least for the locusts anyway. Now, locust was against the god Seth, the god of storm and disorder. Darkness, of course, Ra, the god of the sun. And death of the firstborn, against Pharaoh himself. He was considered a god to the ancient Egyptian peoples, the ultimate power of Egypt. Now, these plagues were large and devastating. And the New Kingdom is a relatively well-known archaeological place. We have a lot of good information there from that time period. But these plagues wouldn't really have left a large amount of evidence. I mean, think, the Exodus is basically just people leaving. They would have taken their stuff, and other people's stuff, as a matter of fact, and left. You're not going to find much there. And the plagues, they mainly destroyed things. Wildlife, livestock, crops, and people. You may notice some extra burials, but not necessarily. The buildings, since they provided some protection from the hail, likely weren't damaged that badly, so it would have been very difficult to notice. And again, they would have been very unlikely to write about this because they were master propagandists. They don't want to record their own failures. So what evidence would you expect to see? Well, Egypt is now missing its labor force. They got up and left. They didn't give them a holiday break, and so they left. We also have the plagues. Destruction of crops, livestock, famine conditions, deaths of people, large number of people, adding to the people that's already left. So we'd expect to see very few great building projects and very few military campaigns. And again, this is exactly what we see in the remnant of the reign of Amenhotep II. We also see that Tutmosis IV, his successor, was the son of Amenhotep II, but not the eldest son. His elder brother disappeared from Egyptian history. So he had to find something called the Dream Stele, which is a stone, under the Sphinx. This was written about 1425 BC, and it supported his claim to the throne. Even Egyptologists will say that this was his evidence, that there was a problem of his succession, basically. Now, we don't know the true name of his older brother. Some label him as Amenhotep, some have him as Tutmos. But we know he just disappeared. There's no explanation for why he's not there, why he did not rule. But the stela basically says the gods had this all in mind so that Tutmosis IV could become pharaoh. And I hope by now you've noticed that a lot of these pharaohs have Moses in the name. Ahmose, Tutmosis, so on. Another good piece of evidence showing that Moses was from this time period. But we also have something called the Ipuwer Papyrus. This is a lamentation poem, and only one copy has ever been found. It dates to the 19th dynasty Ramesside period because it was found in this kind of tomb, a tomb from this period. It was looted though. Archaeologists did not find this. It actually appeared on the antiquities market in the 1800s. Unfortunately, a lot of artifacts do appear this way. It means, one, they have to confirm that they are authentic, and it doesn't give us as much information as we would hope. But they have confirmed this. Secular archaeologists have confirmed that this is an authentic poem found in this tomb. It all fits. Now, critics will not connect this to the Exodus for two main reasons. Because the Exodus is supposed to be mythical, and this poem has to be allegorical because of all the bad stuff happening in it. So it can't possibly be historical because both of these are made up. So they say it was from the first or second intermediate periods, simply because of general descriptions only seeming to be applicable to one of Egyptians' lowest times. It doesn't make sense from their view that such bad things were happening at the height of Egypt's power in the New Kingdom. But the wording and phrases appear to be from the 18th or 19th dynasty. The words used here are only found in these periods, basically. Now, it's possible that this is not the original, that it was completely rewritten, but there is absolutely no evidence for that. We also have Ipuwer, or at least someone by the same name, located in the necropolis at Thebes, so in Luxor. We have an inscription dated to the 16th year of the reign of Tutmosis III, during the part in which he was co-regent with Hatshepsut, about 1488 BC. We also have a Deresi fragment of the 19th century dynasty Ramesside tomb calling Ipuwer the overseer of singers, basically the head bard. He was the head musical honcho. So again, this is dismissed by scholars because they didn't really look at it. They just read it and said, okay, this must be from one of those times, and moved on. But there are many, many parallels, literally and linguistically, between the poem and the Exodus. Even the foremost secular expert on this papyrus agrees with this. But because both Ipuwer and the Exodus can't both be historical events, then it cannot happen. But we have a number of other poems describing historical events. We have the Lamentations of Jeremiah. We also have the Lament for Ur. This is currently at the Louvre in Paris, I believe. Historical events can and frequently are described in poetic form. And I think we have just enough time to get into it. I was going to leave you guys on a cliffhanger, but. So, here are some lines from the Papyrus of Ipuwer compared to events in the Exodus narrative. So we have the river is blood. As one drinks of it, one shrinks from people and thirsts for water. Throughout the land, blood is everywhere. Or pestilence, plague of pestilence. Pestilence is throughout the land. There is no lack of death. All herds, their hearts weep. Cattle mourn because of the state of the land. The plunder. If you remember, as Israel was leaving Egypt, they were instructed, the women, to ask their neighbors for just a cup of gold and jewelry and stuff like that, like any good neighbor would give. And of course, they gave it to them. We have gold, lapis lazuli, silver, turquoise, garnet, amethyst, diorite. Our fine stones have been hung on the necks of maidservants. Gold is lacking. exhausted our materials from every kind of craft. What belongs to the palace has been stripped. The plagues of the locust. Birds find neither fruit nor herb. Seed is taken from the pig's mouth. There is no bright face because of the bowing down before hunger. Barley has perished everywhere. Ladies of the house say, "What that we had something we might eat." Young children say, "It is finished," about sustenance. Officials are hungry and homeless. Even the 10th plague. He who places his brother in the earth is everywhere. Laughter has perished and is no longer done. It is mourning, which is throughout the land, mixed with lamentation. Forsooth, the children of princes are dashed against the walls. Forsooth, the children of princes are cast out in the streets. The prisons are ruined, or the prison is ruined. And he blames the gods. No pilot on duty. Whom cannot create because of the state of the land. The hot-tempered man says, "If I could perceive and know where God is, then I would act for him." It has come to rebellion against the strong Urias of Ra, which pacifies the two lands. Rebellion against the Pharaoh and the gods has occurred, and yet nothing has been done to remedy this disastrous situation. Want is everywhere. So it is, nor has it gone away, though these gods are in the midst. If you want to read it, you can definitely find this online. And while there are definitely things that overlap considerably with the Exodus, there are some events in there that don't match the biblical record. Not because they didn't happen, but the Bible doesn't tell us all the events that occurred within this time period, within this year. And that's where we're going to end today. I know we're going to end a little early, but next time we got some material to go over, and I don't want to end too quickly next time. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. But again, I encourage you can find it online. A Dr. Titus Kennedy is the one that has been really pursuing the Iberwar Papyrus. So if you're more interested in that, look up him. I know he talks about it quite a bit. He also has a website. I'm not sure if it's on there, though. Any questions coming in now? All right. Any questions here? Okay. All right.